up and ready to go for Nancy's presentation. I'm Perry Thomas with the Division of Water. I serve as the Salt River Basin Coordinator, which means that I coordinate water quality and water quantity protection efforts across the basin. We're working to integrate management of flooding and non-point source pollution. I've worked closely with David and others in the Salt River Collaborative, and that group consists of numerous organizations across the basin that are collaborating in protecting water quality and thinking about how to build more resilient communities as we face increasing numbers of floods as a result of increasing intensity and duration of precipitation events.
Well, it's 9:30. I wanted to thank Perry, and Perry's job on this is to manage the PowerPoint show and to advance the slides. It's my pleasure really to introduce Dr. Nancy Theiss. We've been friends for over 40 years, and it's a pleasure to still be able to talk to colleagues, even though it is over Zoom. This is one of a series in the Ohio River discussion series that the Ohio River Recreation Trail, an initiative with the National Park Service to build a recreational trail on water and on land from Portsmouth, Ohio, down to West Point, Kentucky. We're just as involved with the promotion of clean water as well as recreational access and the development of the Rivertown economic systems that go along with that. Another one of the sponsors today is the Ohio River Basin Alliance. It's an interesting group of people that has been working for 35 years to coordinate enhancements on the Ohio River Basin. Recently, the Ohio River Basin Alliance received a fairly significant grant from the Kentucky Division of Water and Orsenco and the Army Corps of Engineers to develop what they call the Ohio River Basin Plan 2020 to 2025. There's a series of working groups that involve education and knowledge, but also transportation, water quality, natural resource management, sort of the habitat pieces, and recreation. So those working groups are going on. We'll be working for the next year and a half to see if we can develop a unified voice around concerns for the Ohio River Basin from all 15 participating states. If anybody's interested in following up with any of that, certainly please feel free to get in touch with me at River City Paddle Sports. Anyway, we're here today on a webinar, and there's a couple pieces that I want to make sure everybody understands that you're all muted except for the three panelists. And if you wish to say something at the end, certainly please note so in the chat. We also are encouraging everybody to use the chat, not only to put your name and organization there, but also to start thinking of questions and start putting down comments. You know, the purpose of this webinar is to really explore the Underground Railroad along the Ohio River, but to start to really have a conversation around history, to have a conversation around current events in our river towns, so on and on and on. So please make sure you use those chats. This is also a class. Russ Barnett and I are teaching a class at the University of Louisville on the Ohio River. So many of the participants on this call are U of L honors students. They are developing a series of recommendations and observations around river towns on the Ohio River and thinking about the power of outdoor recreation to enhance the economic situation in those towns. Interestingly, working with Dr. Theiss, we are going to have a very large exhibit at the Louisville Free Public Library, the Bernheim Gallery, that will focus on history, the economy, the environment of the Ohio River through a series of photographs. We have actually a set of photographs from 1893. Reuben Gold Thwaites rode down the Ohio River with his family and took photographs along the way. So we have current day photographs and old photographs, and it's a fascinating project. Virus willing, it opens on November 24th. If not, we will have a virtual opening, and the exhibit will stay up until the library is fully open and people can enjoy the exhibit. With that said, once again, please make sure you use the chat. And we are recording this to let everybody know, and we're recording the chat, so please be polite. I want to introduce Dr. Theiss. Nancy wrote her dissertation on a neat deal called Life as a Sober Citizen, Aldo Leopold's Wildlife Ecology 118. And what she really ended up accomplishing was getting all of the teaching notes from Aldo Leopold and how people taught back then, how he taught, you know, as the beginning of wildlife ecology. It's just fascinating to me to get all of those teaching notes and then to sort of pull out of it relevant aspects for today. Nancy is a native of Oldham County. She graduated from Murray State University, and then she went on to be the state consultant for environmental education at the Kentucky Department of Education. That's where I met Nancy, and she was actively involved with the first state nature preserve of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, called Blackacre State Nature Preserve, and she introduced me to Blackacre, and I ended up living there for 25 years. So many, many thanks to Nancy. Nancy then went on to become director of the Louisville Nature Center, which still exists today. She was the founding person for it. She was the first woman director of the Information and Education Office for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. Really sort of hired an interesting guy. I think sometimes you are who you are because of the people you hire, but she hired Tim Farmer, who was probably one of the most successful Kentucky Afield hosts, and actively engaged in Kentucky women in the outdoors, and sort of a fascinating project still going on today. Then she, after all of that, decided that she really was fascinated with history and that combination of how land and history come together. And she became the director of the Oldham County History Center in 2003 and has been there ever since. She's written several books, the Oldham County, Life at the River's Edge, fascinating look at how a community develops in relationship to a river. She wrote a book called A Place in the Lodge, Dr. Rob Morris, about the Freemasonry and the Order of the Eastern Star. This past September, she curated and hosted a very successful podcast, and if you haven't checked it out, 30 Days on the 30 Days of Stories on the Underground Railroad in Kentucky. Today, as this screenshot shows you, our topic is really going to be a tour of the Underground Railroad along the Ohio River. And so with that introduction, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nancy Theiss, and we're looking forward to your comments, and don't forget to use the chat. Nancy, you're on.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that very nice introduction, and I appreciate everything you've done for the community, and I'm so excited that you've started this whole project with your friend up in Cincinnati to try to preserve the Ohio River, which I think most sections of it are some of the most beautiful places in the United States. So let's get to the book. I wrote this book to take people off the beaten path and experience probably one of the most important parts of American history. It was a time where people were defining their rights, both women and enslaved Americans, and defining democracy, experiencing these places gave reality to the difficulty of the journey of freedom when I started actually looking at the corridor. Next slide, Harry, there you go. In 2004, when I started at the Oldham County History Center, I noticed we had a whole lot of court records, and being a southern state, this involved a massive amount of slave documents. The campus today includes the Barnett Archives and Library. We're a regional museum. We have an education building. We built a root cellar. We didn't build that root cellar, I'm sorry. That one's 1840. We built a barn that we host outdoor events, and we have a wonderful garden maintained by our volunteer, Jan Jasper. And in those archives were these family papers. And we started this archaeology program in 2007 on the Gatewood site, which was the place where Henry Bibb, a very well-known Underground Railroad conductor, but not so much in Oldham County, lived as a slave, and that was part of Trimble County at the time. Our own place, Archives and Library, was the original home of James and Amanda Mount. They were slaveholders, and he was a local jailer. And so these papers include bounty hunter documents and ownership documents. Okay, next slide. Through our research, we located that original plantation of William Gatewood, and he was Oldham County's first justice of the peace. He was a slaveholder of, as I said, Henry Bibb, and Henry Bibb is glancing over my shoulder here. I'm sitting inside the museum, so he's looking at you. We think he was born around 1814, we're not sure. We began an archaeology program on that site in Trimble County because Trimble County was a part of Oldham County until 1836, and that's when it became Trimble County. So all of the records and things we actually have in our document were once Trimble County, was once Oldham County. You see Janine Kreinbrink sitting there and Doug Von Stroh. They are our two lead archaeologists. Next slide. So who was Henry Bibb? He was the son of Mildred Jackson. He was a slave, and his father was James Bibb, but he never met his father. He was born in Henry County. He had 6 brothers, and they were separated and sold away as a child. He was hired out as a little boy, and his wages paid for the education of Harriet White, who was his playmate and owner. Henry married another slave, Melinda, and they had a little girl, Mary Frances. His last enslavement in Kentucky was by William Gatewood, where he and his wife lived on that site that we've been doing the archaeology on. In 1836, that was his first attempt to escape. And he went to Madison, Indiana. He told William Gatewood he was going to go there and work in the meat markets. And what he did there is he met several very interesting and powerful people in the Underground Railroad. And through that, they encouraged him. He jumped ship. He went up to Cincinnati. He learned more about the Underground Railroad, and he spent the winter in Perrysburg, Ohio, where he worked and saved money. He returned to get his wife and daughter, but he was captured, and Gatewood sold him to the slave trader Matthew Garrison in Louisville. Bibb described the horrendous conditions of the slave jails in Louisville. And then his family was sent to New Orleans to the slave markets. His family was purchased by a slaveholder, Deacon Whitfield, of the Claiborne Parish in Louisiana. He suffered unspeakable beatings and was separated from his wife and daughter and never saw them again. Eventually, Bibb made it to Free Soil. He lectured on the lecture service with Frederick Douglass, and he wrote his narratives. He raised enough money to purchase land in Canada where he had a refugee colony for fugitive slaves. He became a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and he became a really good friend with George the Baptiste, who at the time in 1836 is who Bibb met. George was a free man. He was actually the steward for William Henry Harrison, President Harrison, who died shortly into his term. And then the Baptiste went to Madison to help help freedom seekers. Later, he moved up to Michigan, and that's where he and Bibb reunited, and they were sort of the end of the Underground Railroad. Next slide. So in 2016, the National Park Service awarded the Oldham County History Center 2 sites on the National Underground Railroad Network, the Bibb Escapes Gatewood Plantation Archaeology Site, and then our Barnett Library and Archives at the History Center. And that's Sherry Jackson from the National Park Service. She's our regional coordinator for the National Underground Railroad Freedom to Network. And that's Dr. Afua Cooper, who is one of the leading researchers and historians in Canada that we work with a lot. Okay. In September of 2018, I decided to get a group of friends together and try a 3-day bus tour out up and down the Ohio River. So the friends came with me, and I actually started looking at some of the sites I really hadn't visited before. It was a great success. We started a tour at the History Center. We crossed the Ohio, went to Madison, went on up through Cincinnati, Ripley, Ohio, and then Maysville in Kentucky, following the old Paris Pike to Lexington. And I thought when I was doing that it would be great to lead these bus tours, but it would probably be more fortuitous to write a book about these places so everyone could go on their individual tours in their own cars, which, of course, in these days is a really good idea. So to actually experience the Ohio River and see how people crossed the river and all the tremendous difficulties they went to was inspiring. And what I also found out was I was in stretches of the Ohio River I'd never been before, and it was absolutely beautiful. And it gave you a lot of reflection and a lot of peace of mind to be able to see this area that has basically not changed so much. Okay. Next slide. So what are the main features of the Underground Railroad as defined by the National Park Service? Number one, any place where an enslaved person journeyed to freedom, it can start with an escape site like the Mount House here at the Oldham County History Center, a place of refuge, a trail. Number two, it was a movement that was started by African Americans with assistance from free blacks, institutions of higher learning, religious groups, activists. Number three, it became more organized as the media increased. Around 1840, there was the ability to get smaller presses. People were starting to publish their own newspapers in small towns. And up to by 1860, there were over 150 slave narratives. And slave narratives are written by people who were enslaved, and they describe their life. So that's quite a few. Also, the Ohio River was increasing with steamboat traffic. And there was also the rise of railroads and the development of canals in Illinois and Ohio, which were leading straight up to the Great Lakes, providing, a trail to follow. Okay, next. The Kentucky border of 664 miles along the Ohio River provided a tremendous amount of opportunity for the enslaved to cross into the free soil of Indiana and Ohio. The river was half its size. There were a lot of shallows. For instance, in Madison, Indiana, you could almost walk across the river in the summertime or wade across it. So it really is a different river than what we see today. There wasn't a whole lot of locks that had been built, and so it was easier to cross. Okay. This is a lovely map that David helped me get through this wonderful system up in Cincinnati that he'd used before. And this shows you pretty much the section covered in the book. So you start from Evansville. You can take the book and you can go from east to west or west to east. And what I did is identified pretty much the points that are highlighted in the book where there would have been Underground Railroad activity. So let's start. We're going to go today from west to east because that's the way I organized the slide program. Evansville and Owensboro, when the Northwest Ordinance was passed in 1787, the Ohio River became the geographic division between slave states and free states. Kentucky achieved statehood in 1792. But the states formed from the Northwest Territory, Ohio, which didn't become a state until 1803, Indiana, 1816, Illinois, 1818, Michigan, 1837, Wisconsin, 1848, and Minnesota, 1858. Those areas were yet to be defined. Even those places were declared free soil. Slavery continued with various restrictions known as black codes. So just because you made it across a river, if you were a freedom seeker, it didn't necessarily mean that you were free. These black codes restricted a lot of black activities. Slaveholders moved into these free soil areas and made their slaves sign indenture agreements. Illinois included clauses within its black codes that stated recaptured, escaped slaves would have time added to their indentures. Also, the Ohio River on this far west side turned into the Mississippi, and Missouri, a slave state. It's known that slave catchers would come into the free soil areas and steal free blacks or recaptured escaped slaves and sell them. Evansville was an important port with lots of steamboats that would dock there. We do know that Willard Carpenter, who was a prominent businessman, earned a lot of money through the mercantile trade, and he was a conductor and assisted freedom seekers. On the Kentucky side, there's Owensboro, and about 15 miles east, one of the most famous 19th century Americans, the enslaved Josiah Henson, lived, and he was enslaved by the Raleigh family. His story of freedom became partially immortalized when Harriet Beecher Stowe used Henson's profile as her Uncle Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin. He was born into slavery and worked in the Isaac Riley plantation in Maryland. And Isaac was a terrible gambler. He lost his money, but not before he sent Josiah to his brother Amos outside Owensboro. Josiah was charged with taking other slaves on the boats to Owensboro, including his own wife and children. Instead of resisting the temptation to escape, he gave his word and delivered the entourage safely to Amos. But after some broken promises and potential separation from his family, Josiah took his family and they successfully made it to Canada. He and his wife established a colony for freedom seekers in the United States and Canada. He wrote his narratives. He became famous for his escape. He also became friends with Henry Bibb. And so a lot, the Uncle Tom is mentioned in Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became a negative for a lot of blacks because of the uses of black that was, bowed down to whites, was completely opposite for Josiah Henson. He was extremely amazing. He went through all kinds of suffering, and then he was really an asset to the Underground Railroad movement. Okay, next one. So here you have the Ohio River. You have the two major cities early in the 19th century. You have Louisville becomes a major slave trade center, and that's the Louisville waterfront on the left. And there you have the Cincinnati waterfront, which offered a great potential for escape for freedom seekers because it was much more organized in Cincinnati with a lot of Underground Railroad conductors. I always think it's amazing when you see that Louisville waterfront picture on the left. If you look, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's like any amount of days these boats were coming up and down the river. There would be 8 to 10, stationed right there at the cities. And that's you can recognize the bridge on the right, the Roebling Bridge. That picture on the right in Cincinnati was probably late 1800s, early 1900s. Okay. Most of the slave trading activities took place along Main Street in downtown Louisville, often with individuals being sold at the corner. Slave traders like Garrison, who Henry Bibb mentioned in his narratives, worked with local jailers, often paying fees for slaveholding until enough human chattel could be profitably sent down to the New Orleans or Natchez. And Henry Bibb describes the life in a slave jail. And that prison you see, that held enslaved people as well as felons. They were all in there together, and women and children. So that marker you can tell is across the U of L Basketball Center. There's a couple markers in that site. Okay, next. One of the most amazing things that I found in this research was I went to the Free Public Library in Louisville and went through their microfiche, and there's the Louisville Daily Democrat. I was shocked. June 30th, 1860s. If you see the magnitude of what was going on, these are want ads: 300 Negroes wanted, 250, wanted, I will pay the highest cash price, wanted agents. I mean, it's just unbelievable that we're talking about such a large volume of people. But what a lot of people don't realize about the Underground Railroad movement is that there were many free blacks that lived in slave states. And if you see that figure, 1840, the census for Louisville and Jefferson County, there was 26,987 whites, but there was also 763 free blacks. There were several people that were extremely important in the Underground Rail movement in Louisville. And one was Washington Spradling and W.H. Gibson. This is Spradling's grave over in the Louisville Cemetery. Spradling was a prominent black man and perhaps the wealthiest black man in Louisville during the antebellum years. W.H. Gibson describes Spradling by saying he loved to converse on law, and though uneducated, was considered one of the best lawyers to plan or prepare a case for court. He was very successfully, and nearly every colored person who was in trouble more or less consulted with Wash Spradling. Spradling was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping many of his enslaved brethren out of bondage. In an interview after the Civil War, Spradling stated, "I have bought 33 slaves, a good many of whom have repaid me, and a good many who have not." Shelton Morris was Spradling's brother-in-law and had a barbershop and bathhouse at the old Galt House. Together, they purchased real estate that became the Russell neighborhood today. Morris moved on to Cincinnati in 1841 and started working with some Underground Railroad conductors there. Spradling, I think this part of history, this Washington Spradling was just an amazing person, along with W.H. Gibson, who you can find his stories online if you just Google Gibson. And he tells of tremendous efforts of blacks in Louisville to help. Let's do the next slide. Churches played an extremely important role in assisting freedom seekers. Green Street Baptist, which was organized in 1844, and there's a marker in the church there in downtown Louisville, and the Old Clock Church in New Albany, Indiana, are two recognized places for freedom seekers and abolition of slavery. The Green Street Baptist Church began in 1844 under the leadership of Pastor George Wells. He persuaded slave owners to allow their slaves to attend a church. And of course, these churches would offer education classes, and they served as places for fugitives on the run. This Green Street has had several locations over the years. It was involved in the civil rights movement, and in 1967 hosted a citywide rally to encourage blacks to register to vote. Dr. Martin Luther King made his last appearance in Louisville at that rally. So there are these places that people can visit and experience, you know, the sights and the happenings. And I was just completely amazed about how much information of these people has sort of been lost that contributed so much to the Kentucky we know. Next slide. There are several wonderful places that you can visit in Louisville. Farmington, where the Speed family lived and whose son was friends with Abraham Lincoln. The Speeds had a hemp farm and had large slave holdings to work into that farm. What was something I had never considered was hemp was made into bags, and then it was sold downriver to cotton plantations. Abraham Lincoln visited that home. Locust Grove was created in the 1790s by the Croghan family, and it has restored the grounds and holds events there throughout the year. There's slave cabins that have been restored and give an experience of what the experience would have been like. And this is a picture of one of the slave cabins, but I'll have to say that's a very nice slave cabin. In many instances in archaeology, I learned that, you know, a lot of people who were enslaved slept on floors in the kitchen of the owner's home, or several people would be in more or less chicken coops where they spent their nights and a lot of their lives. Lucy Croghan was a sister of George Rogers and William Clark, and William and Meriwether Lewis, of course, led the Lewis and Clark expedition. Perhaps the most famous enslaved person early on was York, who was on that expedition and was responsible several times for the welfare of the expedition. Many times probably would not have survived without York's help. The Farnsley Mormon plantation in western Jefferson County is another place that you can go visit and see the interpretation of slavery at that time. Okay, next. Of course, I love Main Street, and it has so many museums. There's the picture of York to the left, which is a wonderful statue. It gets a little lost, I think, in visibility there with all the buildings that have grown up around it. And also the Muhammad Ali Center, I think, is a great place to go because they have updated their exhibits on trafficking, human trafficking, and the civil rights movement, and of course, you know, the life of Muhammad Ali. I mean, who could not resist learning more about this extremely brave man? And that's my grandson, by the way, pointing to Muhammad Ali. I think he looks like him. Anyway, next. Next slide. Okay, Blacks Fighting for Freedom, Camp Nelson. If you haven't been to Camp Nelson in central Kentucky, then you're missing something. As the Civil War progressed, the recruitment of thousands of slaves turned soldiers made a huge contribution to the Union Army. Graves of soldiers can be found throughout Kentucky, and recruitment centers like Camp Nelson in central Kentucky were havens for both fugitives and their families. 29,000 Kentucky Blacks were enlisted in the Union Army. That's the most of almost any other southern state or anywhere. And so you can go down and visit Camp Nelson. It's now part of the National Park Service. It's a great trip. Okay, next slide. So here, this is a little bit about, shows you some of the major pathways that have been identified, Underground Railroad routes. Conductors became much more prominent and were involved in more legal battles as they assisted fugitives leading up to the Civil War. Many of these peoples were connected to each other and worked together. Quakers Levi and Catherine Coffin, who originally conducted their work through Newport, moved to Cincinnati on the waterfront where so much activity was taking place. They set up free trade businesses to demonstrate that you could still have honestly produced works without enslaved laborers. The woman on the right, amazing woman, her name is Delia Webster. She got financial assistance from Northern abolitionists. She established a farm, but she was involved in a lot of activities, but it would take hours to go over what she did. But her last things that she did was to establish a big farm in Trimble County, and it became a center, a fugitive center, and she would help people over to Madison. And so she was jailed several times for her activities. Okay, next slide. So this is a Georgetown district in Madison, Indiana, to the left, which was a center of a lot of activity for abolitionists, free Blacks who were assisting fugitives. And on the right is Eleutherian College. It's a bit It's about 10 miles from Madison. Beautiful, beautiful building. It's being restored. It was created by a small community from Vermont and Maine who opposed slavery. They established this college for boys and girls of all complexions. Many of the trustees also organized the Neels Creek Anti-Slavery Society, and they all became known conductors. Next slide. The Freedom Center, beautiful place. What you're seeing on the left is they built that museum around it. The archaeologist that we used, Janine Crimebrink, helped deconstruct and reconstruct this slave pen. The slave pen is from between Augusta and Mayfield, Kentucky, up in Mason County. This man, Captain Anderson, would go around to farmers and buy any people that the farmer wanted to sell. He would keep them in this slave pen and then eventually ship them down to the slave markets to Louisville and to the South. The Roebling Bridge on the right hand across the river in the Newport area has a series of beautiful murals that have been painted that you can see. You can walk through them. If you kayak the river, you can see these. This is a famous story of Margaret Garner. Her story is depicted in Toni Morrison's book, Beloved. She was known to slit her children's throats. She and her children, a family, escaped to Cincinnati but were captured, and she was going to slit her children's throats rather than have them return back to slavery. Her 2-year-old daughter died, but the other 3 children survived. This is a really sad story, but it's beautifully depicted in this mural. Next, in Cincinnati, on the next slide, you'll see the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. It's a great place to visit. This is where Stowe was living. Her father, Lyman Beecher, brought his family to Cincinnati to a teaching job at Lane Seminary, which is not too far from their house. It became well known for its debates on the issue of slavery. In fact, the debates became so controversial that some of the students became ardent abolitionists, and without permission of the trustees of the seminary, formed their own school to teach blacks to read. 32 of the students were asked to leave, and they went to Oberlin College. And Oberlin became known as a college that trained conductors on the Underground Railroad. Most of the characters in Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, are based on Kentuckians, which I did not realize until I did the research for this, such as Levi and Catherine Coffin, Josiah Henson, Eliza Harris, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Stowe herself and her husband, a professor at Lane Seminary, were also Underground Railroad conductors. A lot of people don't know that about her. She was also friends with the Coffins, Cincinnati attorney Salmon Chase, known for the defense of fugitive slaves, later a Supreme Court justice. James Burney, who operated an abolitionist newspaper. John Rankin and his family, known conductors in Ohio. All of these people knew each other. All these people assisted each other. It was an extremely amazing story. This exhibit on the right is at the Ohio Museum Center, which they just opened a year or 2 ago. It's beautiful. And they have a really nice reproduction of the Ohio riverfront there. Next. One of my favorite places on the left, you'll see is Riverside Drive over in the Newport, Covington. These antebellum homes remind me of being in Charleston. And these homes were basically from a lot of wealthy people from Lexington. And they would come up to Ohio and up to this part of Ohio and do a lot of trading in Cincinnati. The man sitting on the bench, they have a lot of interesting statues there, and that one happens to be James Bradley, who was one of the first blacks to attend the Lane Seminary, and they've got a great statue of him. And on the right, when you go to Cincinnati Findlay Market, which is the oldest farmers market there in Cincinnati, they were actually an escape route for fugitives going to College Hill, which is about 8 to 10 miles maybe from the waterfront there in Cincinnati. And College Hill it was a college, and there were people there that were known to be an assist on the Underground Railroad. Okay, next slide. To the left, that is the oldest jail in Kentucky, and that's in Augusta. Augusta is a beautiful little river town, very small, and it still has a ferry that operates there. Of course, it was the home of Heather French Henry, and George Clooney's parents lived in Augusta. So you have a little bitty town with some big personalities that live there. The ferry is charming and wonderful, and it operates daily. So it's a great place to go. Also in this little town were the well-known abolitionists, John and Matilda Fee, and the Tome family. Augusta had a small college there. It was chartered in 1822, somewhat like Lane Seminary in Cincinnati. There were all these little colleges, very liberal education. There was also a Battle of Augusta that took place there in 1862 when Colonel Basil Duke led soldiers and was met with great resistance from a Union Army militia and local townspeople. The Fees were extremely important people in the Underground Railroad movement. Fee was a Methodist minister and was often ridiculed and sometimes tortured for his outspoken sermons that he would have in the northern Kentucky area. He's the one that helped establish Berea College, along with assistance from Cassius Clay. So there's a lot to read and know about him. Like David was saying, this podcast we made, all these people I'm talking about, 30 Days of Stories on the Underground Railroad in Kentucky, there's a lot more description about them and on our website too, about all these people I'm talking about. Slide 24 is the next one. Okay, that house sitting on top of the hill, you're looking at Ripley, Ohio. And Ripley, Ohio was the real Underground Railroad capital besides Cincinnati, on the Ohio River. And that's the John Rankin House. And the slide to the right, that's the John Parker House. Both of them were conductors. Parker, who once was enslaved, he bought his freedom from his work in a foundry in Alabama. He moved to New Albany, but then he went to Cincinnati because he was more interested in helping freedom seekers. And then he went to Ripley, and his family lived in that house. He had patents and his children all received college education. Remarkable man. And he worked, he also wrote an autobiography. He said he assisted 440 fugitives on their way north. And John Rankin, the house up on the hill, he was a Presbyterian minister, and he would have a light in his window that you could see on a river, and that was sort of a beacon for people who were freedom seekers who were trying to make it to his house. He claimed that he assisted several thousand people, and that's now a National Park Service site, just became one. So beautiful place to visit. Next slide. Maysville, Washington, and Paris turnpike to the inner bluegrass, a humongous amount of slave cells. Slaves would come off of that river. They would have them walk down Paris Pike to the Lexington slave markets. Lexington was known for public auctions. But there you have in the middle of all of this was Elijah Green, a black minister who was free and established churches that helped blacks in the Mason County area. And then the Gateway Museum is a wonderful place to visit and learn about that antebellum period of Maysville history. The oldest town in Kentucky, New Washington, is another place to visit very close to there. This is where Simon Kenton came through in the pioneer years. Very historic, beautiful buildings, great place to visit. Okay, next. So as you tour, what I found along this tour, most of these little towns, the National Park Service established the Underground Railroad Network in 1998. And since that time, all of these places have done so much more research and established more recognition of people on the Underground Railroad, which I really wish as a child that I had known this kind of history, because it's a sense of adventure It's a sense of freedom of spirits. It's a sense of sacrifice. And look at all these. This is the park down in Owensboro. You can take your families. There are lots of parks like this. Evansville has a beautiful river park. Of course, Louisville has a beautiful river park. New Albany, Cincinnati, up and down. I mean, it's just a wonderful visit. And then you learn about these people who are relatively uncelebrated in our American history. And this little Whitewater Historic District in Metamora still operates this canal. And canals were extremely important for fugitive slaves because they could follow the canals because they went up, as I said this earlier, and railroads. I never thought about railroads as being important, but fugitives did use the trains to escape too. And conductors often helped them on the trains as well as the steamboats. Next. So these overlooks, that one to the left is from Madison. I mean, how can you get more beautiful than that? That's up on Clifty Falls, which is another great place to take your kids. I didn't know that Ulysses Grant was born right there by the Ohio River at Point Pleasant. They have a area they've preserved in his honor, his birthplace. Interesting man. His father was a good friend of John Brown. John Brown of the John Brown John Brown raid that he led at Harper's Ferry. Big abolitionist. Okay. So this is the podcast that I was talking about. We launched a celebration of the International Underground Railroad in Kentucky in September. Governor Beshear signed that declaration for Kentucky. The Oldham County Chamber of Commerce contacted us regarding a podcast. So after this book that I wrote, I thought it would be a great idea to try a podcast. So with the help of the Chamber of Commerce, we sent out a notice to people, and we had 40 or 50 people respond from all over the United States. So we just selected them to be our readers, and then we used History Center volunteers to introduce each person. It worked out great. It was a big effort in a small amount of space, but what else can you do in a pandemic, you know? And is that the last slide? I think there's one. Okay, so those are some of the recruits that we had. Melvin Diggs, the young man in the right-hand corner, is an honor student at the Eastern Kentucky University. The woman down to the right-hand corner, Regina Lang, her father was the one that notified people about the Anderson slave pen up in outside the Maysville area. Robert Bell, the man with the beard, he's the one that just finished the Morris Mount Roberts Fellowship Program we have here now. This year, he has discovered over 200 Blacks from Oldham County that served in the Union. And he's identified their slave history as well, the people who enslaved them, which is just wonderful. So this is Christina Hartlib to the left. She is the executive director of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House in Cincinnati. Next slide. That's the logo we use, and you can get that series through Spotify, iTunes, and Stitcher. It's the Oldham Podcast Network. Okay, and then is that it, Perry? No. Okay, that's the proclamation, and all of those. When I talked about Camp Nelson, those are graves of Black soldiers that fought in the Union, because there's a national cemetery right beside Camp Nelson Military Cemetery. And there's a proclamation. And I think that's it. Probably my contact. There it is on the left. That's how you get hold of me on our website. That's it, I think.
Well, I thank you very much, Perry and Nancy. And Perry, maybe you could de-share your screen so we can, there we go, so we can see Nancy. Nancy, we have a couple questions so far. And once again, attendees, please write your comments down on there, or if you want, put your hand up and we'll unmute you. We have one question here from Mr. Barnett. It goes, the Ohio River separates free from slave states. Could you talk more about the Fugitive Slave Act that required the return of blacks in free states and state constitutional restrictions for blacks living in free states, Indiana and Oregon? And what are the reasons why most former slaves went on to Canada?
Yeah, well, because of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, that was a defining moment because that allowed people for the first time, bounty hunters and slave owners, to cross the Ohio River. And so there were a lot of free blacks and fugitive blacks living a little north of the river, and they felt pretty secure until the Fugitive Act was passed. And once that happened, all these people who knew probably the blacks living in their neighborhoods were, you know, freedom seekers, they saw these, and they got to know these families, they saw these bounty hunters come into the neighborhoods and pretty much grab people and try to take them back. And so it's very interesting. I was trying to think of the case that created that act was actually from some fugitive slaves from Trimble County. And they were owned, let me see, they were owned by this couple, and they had established themselves. They ran away sort of in northern Indiana, I believe. A year or two later, this man brings a bounty hunter and a sheriff with him, captures these people, but they end up getting away. And then he sues the state of Indiana for protecting them. And that's what created the Fugitive Slave Act. It went to a federal law in Congress and was passed that said and declared that bounty hunters could go across and capture these people. And the man who went after them, his name is escaping, I know it's in the book, I'm trying to look at the book real quick. His name, he got money, the state of Indiana paid him money for the cost of those enslaved laborers. So that's what created that Fugitive Act, and all the slave owners were like, oh good, now we can go across and get these people and get, you know, we can sue the states for them, so. It's kind of gross.
Another question is, could you talk more about Camp Nelson and where is it? And, you know, what was its importance?
Yeah, Camp Nelson, there's a whole story about that too, of course. It was a supply camp. You see, the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to Kentucky because Lincoln wanted Kentucky as the central place for supply camps to get further south. So since it did not apply to Kentucky, that allowed slaveholders to keep their slaves. As the end of the war started approaching, the Union was desperate, more desperate for soldiers. And black soldiers had already joined the Union in the North, but we really needed recruits to help. So he declared that in Kentucky, or any slave that would join for the Union could be free. So all at once you have all these people running away to Camp Nelson to join for the Union, and what followed was their families. So not only did it become a place, a large supply camp, and I'm talking, there was a railroad branch that went down, we're talking outside of Nicholasville. It's very close to Shakertown, okay? And thousands and thousands of supplies, horses, mules, cattle, were driven down through Camp Nelson and then driven on down to the south, like Tennessee and Georgia and the Carolinas, to supply all of these troops that were stationed there. So it's a tremendous amount. And what's interesting is, you know, I can't get in, again, you should listen to the podcast about some of these people, but Salmon Chase at the time was the treasurer for Lincoln. And the man I talked about, Gregory Fee, he ended up going to Camp Nelson to help all the fugitives. There's a very sad story that went on there that I won't go into here, but so it's a great place to visit. Bob Bell, the man who just did the research on soldiers for us, he is on the board there at Camp Nelson, and I can't stress it. It's an amazing place.
Kendall Miller from Rising Sun asks that they're just getting it on their radar. It says going to be more on their radar with the Underground Railroad history. And the question is, at least my question is, how do towns take or understand or publicize or document the Underground Railroad sites that might not be in your book? Is there a strategy for doing that through the National Park Service, or is this phase 2 for your book?
No, you had several questions there. One is, look to your small museum, because small museums spend a lot of time and energy on research in their community, and often they have stories and whatnot that can help. Rising Sun's very interesting because they had a couple there that they had a Black family that ended up there along with an owner, their owner. Her husband died and she joined them, and they became a part of the Underground Railroad. To do more research, I mean, the National Park Service, the way you can apply if you have the research, it's very important that these sites aren't just stories handed down, but there's documented proof. So with Henry Bibb, we had all these ownership papers, and we had Henry Bibb's narratives. And what we did on the archaeology site is we just took what Henry wrote and we followed his path. And we found these places that he wrote about. It was very exciting to do and to honor him. I'm letting Henry show through there. All of these slave narratives, like Josiah Henson, Josiah Henson's narrative identifies who the slaveholders were. And you can go, you can find the Amos farm. And it's just that no one has taken the time, particularly in the southern states. The northern states are much better. Of course, they were free side. There's a bit of a shame that goes on with people who are identified as slaveholders from some families, but it also is extremely important because there is the genealogy side for Blacks that they've never had access to. So all of that, in some instances, is through the research of small libraries and universities,
Margaret Carrero writes, does the phrase being sold downriver refer to how recaptured slaves were often sold down to New Orleans market, where they were often treated even more horrifically than before?
What was the last part?
That down in South, slaves were treated worse than up here. But, could you talk about being sold downriver and the Underground Railroad? Is there a relationship between the two?
Yes, sold downriver does refer to people that were being caught, captured, and sold downriver. One of the best researchers, and she's again in that podcast, has a book called, I'm looking at it right now. Where is she? I just had a mind blank. But, here she is. I don't know where I got her. She's done some amazing research out of Maysville. Carolyn Miller. Carolyn Miller has done she's published some great things. And if you think that life was easier as a slave in Kentucky than working the cotton fields in the South, she can take that perception and throw that one down the tubes, because she has documented some horrible examples of the way people were treated as slaves in Kentucky. Being sold down the river basically meant that you're going to be separated from your family. And of all the things that could happen, even if you were tortured and the slaveholder was horrible, being sold down the river meant that you probably would never see the rest of your family again. There's so many great stories, though, of people like Eliza Harris, who in Uncle Tom's Cabin, she's the woman that grabbed the baby and ran across the frozen river and made it to Ripley, Ohio. She was up there. She came back, and she got more of her family members. She came back disguised. These people are such heroes, and they should be in every story and history book for kids to read, because they sacrifice often themselves for democracy. And I think if we had taken these people's lives and used their narratives after the Civil War in a period of history and celebrated them, we wouldn't have so many of the problems that we have today. It's the same with the women's movement. You know, you take what people have already done, you value that, and you build upon it. And that's what I found very exciting about the Underground Railroad work that I've been doing here at the History Center.
Akram Burton with the African American History Center here in Louisville asks, please speak on the role that reading the play in the freedom struggle of African Americans during that time.
Say that again, David. I didn't quite hear it.
Well, please speak on the role that reading the play in the freedom struggle of African Americans during that time. Akram, maybe we could get you to ask that question because I don't understand it either. While I'm turning on Akram and introducing him, maybe you could, Dr. Perry Thomas asks, during your explorations, did you find potential locations for new parks along the Ohio River, places where interactive exhibits could highlight the role of the river and the Underground Railroad?
Yeah, I think that, thanks, Perry. I think that any of those sites along the book, some of them have a few things they've done. I was disappointed in Owensboro that they didn't capture Josiah Henson's story better. They have the potential to do that, and they do have a trail named in his honor, but his life story is quite incredible. And so I was disappointed. And I think just about any of the places, New Richmond, David, you asked me that not too long ago. New Richmond has done a great job in researching the various places. And Louisville, actually, the west end of Louisville, the Baptist church there, where Martin Luther King's brother was a preacher. The first man that started that, the preacher of that church, talks about his slave history in Oldham County. And he was educated through a school by Elijah Mars, who's another man that helped start college in Louisville, Simmons College. You know, is another, there's so many places that can be developed and continued along this storyline. I think putting the sites in is really important because people get to experience the site and it becomes more real. You know, most people think the Underground Road is some kind of tunnel.
We have, I think Akram is online. Akram, I unmuted you. Do you have a...
Yeah. First of all, Nancy, this has been a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
What I should have said, literacy, all right? Kentucky was one of maybe a few states that allowed Africans to read. And so I was just wondering if you had come across any of that information in terms of their involvement in educating themselves and what have you.
Sure. Henry Bibb is a good example of that. Henry actually taught himself to read by listening to his playmate who actually enslaved him. But mainly the way that most Blacks seemed to learn how to read was through the churches. So the churches, actually slave owners encouraged people who were enslaved to go to church because they felt like it might have been a guilt thing or something for the slaveholder. But I was amazed that Louisville, there was 4 or 5 major Black churches prior to the Civil War that allowed these people who were enslaved to go to these churches, and they were actually, those were the first schools. So I think that if you look at W.H. Gibson's story, who really details and highlights some major Black leaders prior to the Civil War, and he also talks about the secret societies, basically like Freemasons could meet. He talks about, you know, teaching these kids that have been illiterate through the churches during slave times. So I don't know about a law that was passed allowing kids
No,
to...
it wasn't so much law. It was the fact that they had they were not being persecuted for being caught with a book. You go to other states, when you talk about selling down the river, those plantations down the river forbid Africans to read. And if they found out that you could read, they would say that you were tainted, all right? Because usually those are the ones that would foment rebellion.
Yeah, Carolyn Miller talks, but it happened in Kentucky that way too. Carolyn Miller talks about that, about people and being tortured, basically, involved in spreading the word. They had these people called colporteurs that were hired by different organizations, abolitionist organizations, churches, including churches. They would go through Kentucky and they would actually sort of put pamphlets out in the work field, pass them on. And then people would get those pamphlets, and whoever could read in the group, they would read about it. Very interesting.